Today I want to discuss graphic novel reimaginations of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was created in 1886 by Arthur Conan Doyle. But if you think that Sherlock Holmes is just a literary character, think again. In fact, visual artists contributed immensely to the success of Sherlock Holmes already from the outset. It was the illustrator Sidney Paget that gave Sherlock Holmes his characteristic cap and cape, and it was a later actor that gave him his signature pipe. What explains the success of Sherlock Holmes? Well, there is of course the snappy dialogue, where Sherlock Holmes says, "Elementary, my dear Watson." Secondly, there's the question whether Watson is actually a reliable narrator. And finally, there is the fact that Sherlock Holmes manages to bizarrely reveal the secret in the end of each story in a way that the reader could not have predicted beforehand. There is, however, another key to the success of Sherlock Holmes, and that is revealed by the economist Ernest Mandel. Ernest Mandel was a Marxist who wrote a social history of the crime novel. And in that analysis, Mandel states that Sherlock Holmes becomes so successful because he fully embodies what the middle classes in the late 19th century believe that crime fighting should be. It should be scientific, it should be done by people who work with the cops but retain their independence. And finally, in the stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, late 19th century England is basically a good place if it were not for the Red-Headed League and Moriarty and other weird criminals. So we get a very depoliticized approach to crime. This may have explained why Sherlock Holmes remained popular throughout the 19th and the 20th century in all sorts of different places. For an example, it was popular both in the capitalist West and the communist East during the Cold War. Sherlock Holmes stories have become wildly popular. They have featured in films, in TV series, and lately also in graphic novels. There is an immense world out there of graphic novelizations of Sherlock Holmes stories, and to navigate that world, it helps to think about the 4 subgenres of Sherlock Holmes novels. The first version is a historical approach. So that's the classic Sherlock Holmes in the 19th century, doing the stories that Arthur Conan Doyle had already written down. The second subgenre is the contemporary retelling, where Sherlock Holmes is placed in the present. This happens, for an example, in the graphic novel by Boller and Leonardi, in which Watson and Holmes are 2 African Americans in present-day New York needing to solve a murder mystery. The third version is more of a pastiche. Sherlock Holmes is placed next to 19th century artists, writers, or characters such as H.P. Lovecraft, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, or even Houdini. And a very famous graphic novel in which this happens is by Neil Gaiman, in which Sherlock Holmes and Lovecraft need to solve a murder of cosmic horror. And finally, there's the more satirical version, for an example in Sherlock Holmes or Sherlock Bones. These are the 4 ways in which one can tell a Sherlock Holmes story. And in graphic novels, all of these 4 versions have been tried numerous times. 2 books that show the broad range of possibilities for retelling Sherlock Holmes are being discussed here today. And the first one is The Valley of Fear by Edginton and Culbard. He chooses to really tell the Sherlock Holmes story in a classic historical manner. So this is Sherlock Holmes in the 19th century solving crimes as Conan Doyle already had portrayed it. It is, however, a bit looser in style. Edginton has comprised the story to its core and has made the dialogues even more snappy. And Culbard adds to that sense of urgency and speed of telling the story by his somewhat more cartoony and evocative style. For an example, when Watson and Sherlock Holmes exchange glances. These are really sights that say more than 100 words. Completely on the other side of the spectrum is the story Herlock Sholmes as told by Jules and Furtiner. What happens here? Well, Maurice Leblanc had already introduced Herlock Sholmes as a parody on Sherlock Holmes in his Arsène Lupin novels. Jules and Furtiner build on that by introducing Herlock Sholmes in 1960s Yugoslavia. With Sherlock Holmes being a somewhat apolitical character, it was not a problem to introduce that character in 1960s Yugoslavia. And here Herlock Sholmes is a somewhat incompetent, goofy guy who solves crime not so much by device, but by accident. What they manage to do is play with the character, but also play with Yugoslav society without ever becoming truly controversial or subversive. The story, although it stems from a country that no longer exists and an era that is far bygone, it was recently re-inked and republished and is still available today. Sherlock Holmes remains as popular as he has ever been, and graphic novels on Sherlock Holmes keep on coming in. But using the 4 subsystems, we can at least get a lay of the land, and if you want to get to know the full spectrum of the field, these 2 graphic novels are a great way to start. Thank you for watching this episode of Classics into Graphics. If you like this episode, click subscribe and ring the bell, and I'll see you next time.